Welcome to the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation.
Good evening, and welcome to the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation. My name is Paul Bracey, and I'm the founder and president of the center. This evening's guest speaker is David Pepper, who will speak this evening about saving democracy. Before I introduce Mr. Pepper, a few comments about the center. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and our focus is on assisting in human reconciliation by working to eradicate racism and other forms of human oppression. Our staff are all volunteers, and part of the team tonight is Randy Wilding, our Chief Operating Officer, Joanne Zidek, who is our Let's Talk Events Coordinator, and Stephanie Dirkgrill, who is our background technical person who you probably won't see, but you will see Randy later on. Currently, our programs and services are free, and we are funded by donations from people like you. If you have made a donation, thank you. If you haven't done so, please consider making a donation and encourage others to donate so that we can continue to provide our offerings, such as our Let's Talk series, free to you and your community. Visit our website for more information about our work. Thank you. Every presidential cycle, the narrative is similar. This presidential election is the key to saving democracy. 4 years later, the same narrative repeats. But of late, democracy really feels threatened like never before. And in order for us and similar organizations to do our work, it's important that we have a robust environment in which to operate. The threat, if realized, will affect our environment for us, our loved ones, and create an uncertain future for our country's children. A quote from John Lewis that David Pepper used in his book seems very appropriate for this evening. And when I read the quote, I'd like you to think about democracy when I use the word freedom. Freedom is not a state. It's an act. It is not some enchanted garden perched on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. Freedom is continuous action. We will all take, and each generation must do its part to create an even more fair, more just society. And this is from John Lewis's book, memoir, Across the Bridge, A Vision of Change and Future for America. Once we understand that the true front in the battle to save our democracy is the political environments of our states and local communities, the quote of John Lewis will ring true for us. The need to have a broader and deeper strategy to save democracy is something that David will walk us through this evening. David Pepper is a lawyer, writer, political activist, former elected official, adjunct professor and author of Laboratories of Autocracy and Saving Our Democracy, which is the focus of his talk this evening. What we can do and must do. David was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. He is a fifth-generation Cincinnatian. He earned his BA, magna cum laude, from the Yale University, where he was Phi Beta Kappa, and later earned his JD from Yale Law School. We are honored to have David with us this evening and this opportunity for him to share his insights into the battle to save our democracy. Please join me in welcoming David Peppers. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. Great to be with all of you tonight in a busy election season. I know people have a lot of things they can do, so I'm honored by everyone who's joining us. I will pick up on what Paul described, the John Lewis quote, the bigger context. Obviously, I think we're at 20 days now from this showdown that mostly gets focused on as a presidential election. And so what I'm going to talk about tonight may feel a little bit off topic, but it won't when we get to the end. My worry, and this is why I wrote the first book I wrote, called the first nonfiction book, called Laboratories of Autocracy, followed by Saving Democracy. The reason I wrote these books is because I worry that we have not really seen the broader battle for democracy in the right way. And until we do that, even if the results at the presidential level feel like they saved democracy, which I think many thought that was the case in 2020, not everyone agreed, the erosion of democracy continues. And that's because there's a deeper struggle that's happening that goes way back into our history, that included a struggle for democracy back after the Civil War, after Reconstruction. So I want to talk about that tonight, so people have a broader frame when they think about this battle for democracy. And what I hope comes out of my conversation and then the Q&A is, people, wherever you are in America, around the world, and I think we have guests here from beyond the United States tonight, people see that there's much more they can do in the way that John Lewis described about protecting democracy than they typically think they can do. And so the whole point in the end, despite you're going to see some sobering observations, is my hope is it's empowering that people see the battle for democracy. They are right at the front line wherever you are. So let me start with a PowerPoint, some slides, and then go to questions when I'm done. So this might be especially relevant for those who aren't in the United States right now, but I want to ask a question, sort of a hypothetical, which is, what if we all saw the following elements happening in another country all at once? We saw in that country, first and foremost, the rigging of districts and elections, really, so that 99% of the results were guaranteed before the election even happened. And a power that was in the minority in terms of the viewpoints of the people retained power, even if the other party, even if the other people campaigning against them earned a majority of the votes. What if we saw in that same country the attack on the independent operations of elections and vote counting by the folks that are in power due to those rigged legislative elections, so they had more control over the way elections are run and votes are counted? What if we saw the folks in power in that other country? Let's pretend it's Eastern Europe or something. What if we saw them attack specifically, in a very specifically targeted way, the ways in which the voters of the opposition party voted, made it more difficult, or simply eliminated the way that the opposition party voters chose to vote? They eliminated that as an option. What if that party in charge, in the way that, let's say, Putin did when the Ukraine war started, attacked by law the protesters that largely reflected the views of the opposition party? What if we saw that country attack independent courts, strip those courts of jurisdiction, or simply ignore the rulings of those courts, or change the way those courts are selected so that the court was essentially nothing but a rubber stamp for the folks in power, no independent check and balance? What if we saw that country also simply ignore the will of their own electorate as had been expressed through referenda? The voters vote for one thing through a direct referendum to change something, and the people in power simply don't do it. What if we see those folks in power directly violate their own constitutions, but nothing happens? What if we see them change the laws to protect themselves from being held accountable for corruption? What if we saw that country change the way history or society is taught, such that things in the past that would cast a bad light on what they are doing are simply censored, cleansed out of that teaching? I think we know what would happen, actually, if we all saw all these things happening at one time in another country. In fact, we see these things happen in other countries. We see it with Hungary and Viktor Orban. We've seen it to an extreme degree in Russia. I think we all know that when we see all these things happening at once, we don't just say to a country like that would be experiencing this, hey, you have an issue with voting rights, or you have an issue with history. We would say, if all these things are happening at one moment in your country, you have a five-alarm fire taking place about democracy itself. The most important protections of a democratic rule of law system, if all these things are happening once, are at risk, and you better do something quickly, or you will lose your democracy, you will lose your rule of law, you risk slipping into an authoritarian state. Wouldn't we say that? I think we would. I think we would send in technical assistance. We would try and find people who could actually save the day. And the reason I wrote my book, Laboratories of Autocracy, sitting here in Ohio, isn't because although I would be concerned about it happening in Hungary or Poland, it's because everything I've described just now is happening in the United States of America, in states. Everything. Not just one or two states, and not just one or two of these things, but most of them, or many of them, are happening in many states at one time. And we don't see it. We don't notice it in the same way we would. We don't seem to be as alarmed. Now, maybe this is changing a little bit more lately. But when I wrote this book, Laboratories of Autocracy, and followed it up, my concern wasn't that all these things are happening at one time in all these states. My concern is that we don't see it as we would see it in another country. Now, why don't we see it that way? We don't see it that way first because, one, we're in a very partisan time. And the partisan sort of view of things, where everyone's on a side, obscures the reality that all this is happening. And when we see another country, the advantage that we're not in that country is we don't probably know what party is what. But if we saw these things happening, we'd say, I don't know who's in what party, but this is a direct assault on democracy. But in our own country, we don't see it, I think, partly because how partisan things have gotten. And our partisan argument blinds us to what's happening at this level that is such a scary set of developments when it comes to the health of democracy. Number two, we don't see it because I think that in the United States versus other countries, we mainly focus on the people of politics. We focus on the large figures, be it Trump or be it Kamala Harris or whoever, and we don't see the institutions of democracy as clearly as we need to. And so when something is happening at this level that is a deep, deep undermining of the institutions to protect democracy, we just don't see it as clearly as we see, our thoughts on Jim Jordan or our thoughts on Marjorie Taylor Greene or AOC or any of it. And then the worst part, not the worst, but the third factor is the institutions that we really don't pay attention to, where all this is happening, are state houses. And these are simply not institutions that we pay attention to. And the lesson of these books I've written and what I'll say tonight is when democracy is being undermined first and foremost at that level in a way that reverberates at all levels, including federal, including the presidency, we better pay attention to this institution in particular, because frankly, even more than the federal government, although that could change depending on election outcomes, but right now, more than the federal government, it is the state houses of America, dozens of them, that are pulling at democracy in a way that puts it greatly at risk, including right now. So that's my very bleak opening, that again, if we saw what's happening in our state houses in another country, we would see it for what it was. In America, we just don't see it, and we need to wake up to it. And this is why I wrote this book, both books. Going back to what Paul said, I believe until we see this problem, we will never really do what we need to do to save democracy. And so seeing this is critical. So there is a crisis in American democracy. Yes, it's at many levels. It's playing out in all sorts of ways. But as I tried to emphasize in this book, the heart of it actually starts at the state house level. To use that old James Carville quote that some of you may remember from the Clinton campaign, it's the state house is stupid. That is where it's happening. That is where we're seeing so much damage. It ends up reverberating at all levels. So I want to talk for a few minutes. Why state houses? Why do they end up being this this fulcrum, this incredibly important center of power that if they become sort of non-democracies, that they do great damage at all levels of democracy? And again, this is to go back in history, and I won't go through it today. This is exactly how we got Jim Crow out of Reconstruction. It was not a federal strategy, although the federal government not supporting democracy in the southern states was important. It was a state level, state house, state constitution strategy that made the attack on the new democracy of Reconstruction so decisive and long term. It was the state level. And my worry is that's a little bit about that's similar to what we're seeing right now. So why state houses? Why are they, as I call them, the Achilles heel of American governance? Why are they so detrimental if in the wrong hands? Well, it's because going back to our founding, our states, led by state houses, have certain powers that are at the heart of American democracy that are far too often overlooked. The first thing is these state houses control virtually every issue that is of great sort of contest and controversy in American politics. If you want to get things done on an agenda, the truth is you'll get a lot more done on those issues at state houses than the federal government. And those issues include all aspects of the economy, taxation and spending, almost all aspects of healthcare run through states. Obviously, federal government spends money, but those monies go through states. Almost all aspects of education are state level. Who's taught what, how you pay for it, the quality, the access, the subject matter. That sometimes gets impacted by Congress. That's mainly a state issue. Energy, climate, and you'll see within these topics are all the major contested issues of American politics. In the healthcare bucket, you've got a woman's right to choose or lack thereof. You've got IVF. In public safety, you have issues like, criminal justice system, guns. All of this runs through state houses, far more than Congress. And one thing you'll know about state houses, they're far more active than Congress. I mean, I don't mean to be negative about people in Congress. It's important. But if you look closely, almost nothing ever happens in Washington, honestly. The first 2 years of a presidency, sometimes, you normally have divided government. You have a filibuster in the Senate. State houses almost have none of those obstacles. So not only are the subjects of state house legislation the most important topics in American politics and policy, state houses work on pure majority rule most of the time, and they can rush through this stuff and do all the time. State house sessions are incredibly busy. They're crowded. They're kind of nuts sometimes, while Congress, very few bills get through that really break through as being that important. So that's one reason state houses end up being this really important source of power. Number two, though, and maybe even more important, it turns out state houses, far more than Congress, wield great power, the most power over democracy itself. States are the ones that write the election rules of America. Those rules include who votes, when they vote, how they vote. Can they vote for a month, a week, a day? Do they have drop boxes? How do people register? How do they get purged from the rolls? We're seeing a lot of controversy over that lately. And with that power comes an enormous ability to shape the electorate. That can be a good thing if you want to have a fully inclusive democracy, or that can be a bad thing. Going back to Jim Crow, you can shape the electorate in ways that are horrible or that favor you in an upcoming election. So the power over democracy itself in these state houses is enormous. Far greater than the congressional power. Every once in a while, not as often as I would like, there's a voting rights bill out of Congress. I wish we had renewed the Voting Rights Act after Shelby County, for example. But states pass election laws all the time. No water in Georgia. In Ohio, they just made using drop boxes more difficult. In other states, there are all sorts of other rules. Voter ID, very, very active legislating around elections in a way that truly does change the electorate or change the ability either easier or harder to vote. Next, state houses not only write the election rules, they draw the district lines of for the most part, not all, but because there's been some reforms, but for the most part, it's states that draw the lines to determine the congressional districts and the state house districts. And again, that is an awesome power. In the right hands, that power can lead to a broadly representative majoritarian system where people are represented, the state's majority is represented, minority groups are represented in where they live. In the wrong hands, you can rig the whole thing. You can draw it so you never lose. You can draw it so most politicians never worry about an election ever in their whole careers. You can draw it so that the majority viewpoint of a state is thwarted and that minority viewpoints actually are what get legislated. So in the right hands, it's a great power. In the wrong hands, it can be quite a destructive power. And the other big topic over democracy, which we saw play out in 20 when the president who had just lost tried to change the outcome, the states control the presidential elector process. And we could see a similar controversy over that in the coming months. So not only do these states control every issue we care about, they have the unique power of controlling democracy itself. And in the right hands, that's good. And in the wrong hands, like Jim Crow 130 years ago, it can be very, very destructive. Here's the other thing that these state houses control. They essentially, I wouldn't call it veto power, but they have enormous control over other levels of government. Federal policy like the Affordable Care Act or Medicaid, that or education dollars, those flow through states and state houses. So those state houses can control much of how those dollars are spent. Statewide officials, governors, and secretaries of state, although better known, often can only work within the confines of how the state house allows them to. And at the local level, a lot of times in states like Ohio, the state houses sort of ride herd over local government and tell you, you can't do this, you can't do this. You know, in Ohio, there's no ability for local governments, for example, to write their own gun laws or to ban plastic bags. The state house has said, we're going to legislate that. You can't even do that. So state houses have this hidden power where they can impact officials at all other levels. By the way, ironically, those other officials are far, far better known than the state house officials who are largely unknown. And that gets us to, sorry, let me go here. Let me go through here real quick. That gets us down to this area, which is, you know, I've mentioned all this power, but I also mentioned that state houses are the Achilles heel of American governance. Well, that's because all this power that I just described is in a body that almost no one knows anything about. And that mismatch, that disconnect is dangerous. These are low-profile elections. Almost no one, they know their mayor, people know their congressmen generally, their governor generally. They have no idea who the state house rep is for the most part. And that state house rep has all the power I've described. Lack of media coverage makes it so no one has any idea who these people are or what the state house does more generally. It's getting worse, as you know, as local and state level media atrophies. Often these state houses are in faraway state capitals. So in a lot of states, you hardly ever hear about them. Many of them have short sessions. So the disconnect between the power and the lack of knowledge of what they do is a real problem. That, again, if your goal in life is to get some really unpopular things done, and sadly that is the goal in some cases, there's no better place to go to a state house because no one pays any attention. And an agenda that wouldn't see the light of day in Washington because it's too controversial, back in state houses, you can get it all done and no one even knows. So real quick, because I talked about this for a second. Going back to this gerrymandering, the drawing district lines. Here is how extreme the power to gerrymander has become. And this is a really important part to understand about why the combination of these things is building right now to really undermine democracy in states. Just as an example of how incredibly powerful the gerrymandering has been and can be in the wrong hands. And this is why I'm a big believer in bipartisan, nonpartisan districting reform. We're trying to do that in Ohio right now. Congress needs to do it. Here is what happened between 8 and 12. 2011 was the year of the redistricting in all these states. And between 2008 and 2012, you'll see a dramatic shift in who represented these states. And the irony, if you look at these two slides, is Barack Obama won all four of these states by almost the exact same amount in the year 2008 and the year 2012. In Ohio, it was 3 to 5 points. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, a little more. But even though these states were almost the exact same makeup in the electorate and the same margin for Obama, look at the change that happened due to a 2011 gerrymander in those states. Ohio went from a 10-8 delegation in Congress of Democrats versus Republicans to 4-12 the other way, just as the Ohio State House flipped. Not because the voters were any different, because the districts were different. Same story in Michigan, same story in Pennsylvania. Look at Pennsylvania. From 12-7 to 13-5, same blue Pennsylvania. And then look at Wisconsin. It went from 56-42 to a 60-39 supermajority the other way. That's not the voters, folks. That is gerrymandering. That's how powerful it is. And that's how much, again, these are in 2012, all four of these are blue states. Yet the gerrymandering made them very red states when it came to their state house as well as Congress. And by the way, these gerrymandering maps, these gerrymander maps last a long time. In 2018, this is still how these maps looked. 8 years after the maps were drawn, you still had a situation where Wisconsin maybe is the most extreme, but all of them, a majority of voters voted for Democrats by 9 points. That's quite dramatic. Yet that majority 9-point victory across the state led to a supermajority of the other party. That is a system that Vladimir Putin would admire, that the minority party is a supermajority in the legislature, passing laws that reflect their views and not the views of 54% of the voters of that state. That's how dramatic the gerrymandering power is. There's something about this, though, that's even worse than the fact that you have these a majority not represented in these state houses. The damage to democracy is actually deeper than just that problem, which is essentially that you have minority rule in states due to gerrymandering. You have a second problem that comes with this gerrymandering. You have a situation where most of the elected officials in states that are highly gerrymandered almost never worry in their entire careers about an election. And that turns into even a worse consequence of gerrymandering than the fact that it doesn't reflect the people of the state. I went through this for my book, Laboratories of Autocracy, and I did an update in Saving Democracy, where you have out of what 60, how many districts do we have here? Out of 62 or so districts that the Republicans drew themselves in Ohio in 2011, 50 out of those 62 were 20% margin of victory or more districts on average the entire decade. Meaning they were 50 out of 99 people that essentially never worried about their election the entire decade. Another 12 were 10% or more. Not a single one averaged a single percentage margin of victory. So you essentially have a majority that's fully knows that it's locked in no matter what. And boy, is that unhealthy. And let me go through how much worse this gets in a second. I'll go through here. Sorry, this is not just an eye test. This is sort of a very intensely small slide. Hopefully you can see it. What happens when you have a system where, almost going back to this one, where you have these large margins of victory over time, and this is what's happened in America in all these states, you have a situation, again, going very similar to Jim Crow, where people decide in the end to not even run for office because they don't think there's any chance to win. And because the party who is in the minority party, in this case, the Democrats, basically decide it's not worth running. It's not worth the energy. It's not worth the time. So why bother? And what we have in recent years, and this changed a little bit this year with the presidential, but in 2022, this is maybe the most shocking slide of the entire presentation. State after state, you had massive percentages of these state house districts. Again, where all that power is, where all that stuff happens, you literally had in these states many times 50% of the incumbents in the majority with no opposition. You all may remember it was this big news event when the Tennessee majority kicked out 3 of their colleagues, and ultimately 2 of them they got kicked out because they were part of a protest after a shooting, for goodness sakes. 40, and I saw that. I thought, this is not the behavior you'd expect from a healthy representative body. Well, it turns out 49% of the people who kicked out the 2 Justins had not faced an opponent in the prior November. We're talking people who literally just go back to office without a general election and usually a primary election opponent. 50% of them, half the majority, no election whatsoever. You have other states that are even higher. Oklahoma's at 60%, Louisiana 80%. The current, and I don't say this for a partisan reason, but the current Speaker of the House, literally, his first race for State House was uncontested. His second race, his re-election, was uncontested. He literally was in the state House for 4 years, had never won an election. He didn't have any opponents. In other states, you'll see 50, 60% uncontested. A state doing well is 20%, which again is millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people with no choice. So you have these systems where you literally have stopped seeing contested democracy. Either they're not close, or even worse, no one runs at all. And what happens in such a system, and this is the part where I think we have to start seeing how damaging lack of democracy becomes when there's no accountability. What happens is, and I speak to this at having been an elected official who worked across party lines, had good relationships, but my county that I was a county commissioner of was a 50-50 county. I knew in a 50-50 county that I did better by working across party lines to get things done. I also knew that if I want to get myself reelected because I'd have a real election, I better deliver some good results for the people. Better health care, better streets, better schools, whatever it is, I better have something good to say, right? Well, in a world where you never have to worry about your general election, all the incentives that we believe lead to good public service disappear, and even worse, they get twisted upside down. If you know you're going to get reelected no matter what, if you have no opponent election after election, the truth is delivering good public outcomes no longer matters to your career. You can deliver the worst schools, the worst roads, you can, be semi-corrupt. None of it stops you because in November you face no opponent, or at least no opponent that anyone thinks can beat you. So that's a very dangerous moment when public service, when being in government, you no longer feel any accountability to deliver good public outcomes. What do you have in a world where you don't have a general election for the most part? You end up having this terrible incentive to serve private interests, because they have more influence on how you do long-term in your career than the public. That energy company, they can support an opponent in the primary. The other private interests, they control your fate more than the public does because you don't have a general election. And what do often those private interests want from you? They frankly want you to give them part of the public pie, public assets, public power. Regulate us less. Give us some public dollars to bail us out. And so what you have is this really screwy incentive in these systems of you do better by serving the private, by giving the private what was supposed to be for the public. The private rewards you for it, and the public can't stop you for doing it. And that's why what you see in many states like Ohio is a downward spiral of outcomes as they give public goods over to private players who don't spend it on public outcomes, they spend it on themselves. Another thing that happens in these systems is that the primary becomes the only way you can lose your office. And if the primary is the only way you can lose your office, The only thing you know will cost you your office is if you're too much in the middle. Working with the other party is how you lose. You'll be called a rhino, for example, at least in a Republican state. In a Democratic gerrymandered state, maybe you're called a dino. But working with the other side is how you lose. Terrible incentive. How do you avoid a primary? By someone saying you're too moderate, you go as far to the extreme as you can. That keeps you from being primaried, and not being primaried is the way you keep in office. You also, in the end, and this is really important, once you have the system of you're being an extremist to avoid a primary, you're delivering public goods to private players, your public outcomes are suffering. Third from the bottom, and this is how we have this downward spiral we're seeing in terms of democracy. Once you've decided, once you've given yourself, once you're on a course as a public official that you are doing extreme things that do not relate back to the mainstream of your community because you want to avoid a primary. Once you are delivering terrible public outcomes, to go third from the bottom here, the one thing you know will cost you long term is if democracy ever is returned to your system. If the voters ever face you in a fair district and can vote you out, you probably will lose because your results are poor public outcomes and you're too extreme for your district. And so one reason we see the nonstop attack on democracy in states that are highly gerrymandered is because those officials know if there ever were a non-gerrymandered world, if they ever were in fair districts, if voters weren't suppressed but everyone was voting, people with records of terrible public outcomes that are too extreme would probably lose. And since they don't want that, you continue to see more and more and more voter suppression and more intense gerrymandering because that is needed to keep the extremism going. So that's sort of the very bleak thing that happens in these state houses that turn out to be very, very gerrymandered. A couple of other things real quick. I'm going to go to the good stuff, but I know this is kind of bleak, and I'm not reading the comments to get through this. I believe I call this first book a wake-up call because until we see this, we won't solve it. We'll keep thinking we're saving the day, but if we don't solve this, we're not saving the day. Now, here's the problem. I mentioned that these folks are sort of anonymous. No one knows who they are in their gerrymandered districts where they often have no opponents. There's an exception to that. Certain powerful interests know exactly who they are. They know exactly what they can do. They understand the power of state houses to financially benefit, to pass social policy that isn't mainstream, but can be done through a state house where there aren't real elections. And the problem is that those folks are in the state houses all the time getting their agenda done. And that's where we see these state houses become sort of these, I call it laboratories of autocracy. They are used in this way to accomplish the agenda of people who know how they operate, while the average person can't do anything about it if they even know about it. And that's why you see state houses being sorry, real quick, I want to go to this. That's why you see state houses begin to be, there's a group called ALEC doing this. They have become essentially harnessed to do what I'm talking about. They're not simply, one state at a time. Across the nation, we see state houses being harnessed to push through a national agenda that would never again see the light of day in DC. So I won't spend too much time on this, but one of the problems, and forget the two donkey and elephant here. If folks who are only focusing on the federal level and only focusing on federal swing states, if that's all they focus on, while another side is focusing at the state level, that undermines democracy, that state level effort will succeed, won't it? Because if all you do is win 5 or 6 Senate races for federal Senate purposes, or 5 or 6 swing states for election purposes, but you don't focus at the state level in all these state houses, you're not really stopping anything I've described. You could win all your federal goals, but the state level nonstop attack that takes advantage of these weaknesses, that pushes an agenda through the states, isn't stopped at all if all you are doing is fighting the federal level. And that gets me to what we have to do about all this. I don't mean to jump around so much, but I want to make sure I get through this. How do we take this on? Then I'll get to Q&A. And this is a sobering picture, like I said, but it's also something that I hope is eye-opening. It goes back to John Lewis. We have to see, and this is the problem, some of the pro-democracy side has just not seen this. We have defined the entire battle of democracy as a federal battle, while democracy is being undermined at the state level, frankly, more than the federal level. And that's you go back in time. If democracy were safe and sound, I think it'd be perfectly fine to say, okay, democracy's safe. Let's focus on federal offices. But once you realize that no, democracy itself is never secure, you have to always fight for it in the way that John Lewis said. Once you reframe the battle that the battle we are in today is a democracy battle, the same battle that we've been fighting our entire history. Once you see that, I think you allow yourself to reframe what you have to do so you have a deeper strategy to save democracy. And what does that strategy look like? If you really think about this as a battle for democracy itself, and not only a federal battle for certain offices in a few swing states, which is just scratching the surface of what you have to do. Well, one, to go back to John Lewis, you see that the battle for democracy itself is a long battle. When people only focus on a few federal swing states for a few offices, what happens is they fight like a 2-year battle, and every 2 years they do it. And in December, they stop doing it and they take a break for a year, then they get geared up again. If you're fighting for democracy itself, that's clearly a losing strategy. And I always go back and think, the suffragists in the 1800s that were in the same battle they were in about democracy. You think they only focused on elections? They couldn't even vote. They understood it was a long game. They were, the folks at Seneca Falls were fighting for suffrage for people who weren't even born yet to great-granddaughters. They knew that it was a long game. And once you see as democracy itself, you realize we're in the same long game. It's not a start and stop every 2-year thing. And every strategy to build and secure democracy must be a long-term strategy, not a short-term strategy. I happened to go to law school with Stacey Abrams. She understood the battle for democracy in Georgia was a long game strategy. She didn't simply fight it, every 2 years. She would have quit in 2002 if she had decided her fate based upon a Senate race in Georgia in 2002. She knew it involved struggle for voting rights and for inspiring people to vote. And she ran herself and didn't quite win, but she inspired people to vote all over Georgia. She saw the long game, and we have to see it the same way. And one of the sort of liberating things about seeing it as a long game battle for democracy is that you can see progress through thick and thin. You don't judge everything based upon an election result, whether or not you won a Senate race, like Stacey didn't. You can see that you register more voters or turnout was higher in areas where it used to not be. Once you see it's a long game, you can see you're making progress through thick and thin. And you don't just quit because you don't happen to win the federal office you're seeking. So that's one. Number two, and this is, I feel this to my core, especially I've traveled the country and I've spoken in Oklahoma, in Nebraska, in Arizona, and all these other states. And we have to see, and this reminds me of what Martin Luther King said when he said, we go where injustice is. He didn't only go to swing states for elections. He went to some of the toughest places when it came to democracy in America to fight that fight there. The battle for democracy must be waged in all 50 states, not just 6 or 7 swing states. Wherever you see the broken system I've described, we owe it to those citizens, those millions of citizens, to fight for a real democracy. The state could be a red state too, by the way, and in a fair system, it could be a red state, but it shouldn't be a rigged state with massive voter suppression and corruption. And the fact that, and this is something I blame Democrats for until very recently, the idea that we don't go fight for democracy in most states because we don't think it will lead to a federal result of a Senate race is not a pro-democracy strategy. It's leaving dozens of states to wallow in a complete lack of democracy and a society that doesn't reflect the people of those states. So we have to fight for democracy in all 50 states. Now, the goals may be different in different states, The goals in some states are simply to run in more places, to not have 60% of races be uncontested. But we can no longer just say to a state, sorry, you don't qualify as important because we don't think you can elect a U.S. senator that we like. That is not the appropriate response. Just like, again, Martin Luther King would go anywhere where he said injustice anywhere means injustice everywhere. We have to have the same attitude about democracy today. Once you're in states, we have to see that it's not only about the federal offices. The front line in the battle for democracy in today's America are the state houses. It's state house races and it's state houses where most of the impact that we're seeing on democracy that we feel is undermining it, from censorship to voter suppression to different types of extremism, attacks on independent universities, all of it. The things that if we saw in Hungary, we would say that's not a democracy. That is mainly happening in America at the state house level. So we have to focus there. And we have to get out of this problem that we basically are leaving many of these places uncontested. If the most damage is being done through these state house districts, then there better be people running in those districts, not because they're necessarily going to win, but at least, and hopefully, in some cases, there's a good competition, but at least it means there's some accountability, there's some transparency. There is nothing worse for democracy than an uncontested race, which essentially means there's no accountability or transparency for what's happening. This is going to sound very strange. I won't get into too much of this. This is often, the Democrats will often say, oh, if it's only about Trump, it's never Trump. That is not the way to define what we're in right now. Obviously, that sounds strange with 20 days to go. And this is a criticism of Democrats I'll make. We saw what happened in 2020. Trump lost. But the attack on democracy never slowed down after he lost, did it? You saw in the Arizona State House phony audits. You saw in the Georgia State House bans on water at polls. You saw in Ohio new voter ID law that's had a really immediate impact. All that happened after Trump lost. Defining this as only about Trump is much too narrow for what's happening. This has to be about democracy itself and defining it well. And frankly, and this I think goes to the heart of what this institution does, the Bracey Center, joining hands across party lines to lift democracy. Once you define it not only as about one person, but about democracy itself, that liberates you to work across party lines when you can to lift democracy. Whether it's Liz Cheney, whether it's others, if you see this as a battle for democracy and not party, it opens up the opportunity to work across party lines. And I've seen this happen in Ohio. This is a really important point. We had a major showdown about democracy last August, where the State House in gerrymandered power wanted to make it harder for us to do direct ballot initiatives. And we defeated it 57-43. We crushed it. Why? It was not just Democrats. It was Republicans, independents, the Libertarian Party, and Democrats. Kasich was against it, just like I was. We all came together and said, that's not democracy. We're uniting across party lines to defeat it. And right now, we have in Ohio an initiative on the ballot right now that would end gerrymandering, at least by the politicians, and it would get them out of the process, and it would lead to a districting panel, multi-partisan, not made of politicians, made of citizens. And who's leading it? The former Republican Chief Justice of Ohio, Democrats, independents, the Libertarians again support it. I hope it passes. But once it's close. The other side's making a lot of noise about it in dishonest ways. But the point is, we are not defining it as simply a partisan matter. We're defining it as democracy itself. And I think that's a really important point. If you want to have a sustained long-term win for democracy, it's got to go beyond the partisan labels. Number 5, very important. I hope, and maybe the most important. Once you see that much of the work to lift democracy is not just campaigns, not just federal offices, and it's not only 5 or 6 swing states. My hope is that people feel empowered that wherever they are, they can make a difference. It's not, they don't just watch, CNN or Rachel Maddow and think, oh, democracy's falling. But I can't do anything about it because I live in New York, California. My hope is that they see, well, I can do something right here, because if the problem is my Oklahoma State House doesn't have enough contested races, or my local school board is being taken over by folks who don't believe in democracy, people can actually do something about it, not just to help a battle, 1,000 miles away. They can work in their own backyard to live democracy. And there are many ways, once you see the battle correctly, beyond partisan politics, that you can make a difference. And I use in my books, in the Saving Democracy book, a footprint. And I say to folks, look at your footprint of influence in the world. Because once you see that it's a long game democracy battle, you see, I hope, that there are many, many ways you can make a difference beyond just helping a candidate or beyond, voting, although those are critical. Because it's a nonpartisan battle for democracy, you could use every part of your footprint to lift. Examples I would give. Let's say you're on a health clinic board. Your health clinic could be registering voters every day. Whoever comes in the clinic's doors could be asked if they're registered, just like a homeless shelter, just like a food bank. Do you run a restaurant? You could have a kiosk there to register the folks who work in your restaurant or the ones who you serve there. Do you live in an apartment building? You could have a system where any new apartment resident is asked if they've updated their address so they can vote. There are so many ways that alumni groups, schools, you name it. Most of this stuff is not done. Do you know the mayor of a city? Cities right now, the residents of many cities are being suppressed by state house laws. Every mayor of every city should use every aspect of their city hall, be it the rec centers, the libraries, public housing, to engage those voters in a nonpartisan way to get them back on the rolls they're being purged from their state house. Do you know the mayor? Is he or she doing that? The point is, once you see that the battle for democracy is a long game battle in all 50 states at all levels, you see that we all are on the front lines. There's far more we could be doing, and much of the things we could be doing are simply not being done. So while one side is using state house power to crush democracy all the time, the side that cares about democracy is often leaving tools and tactics just on the table, not undertaking them, because they don't see the battle in the same way. And that gets us back to go where we started. That's what John Lewis was talking about. Freedom is not a state, it's an act. It's not some enchanted garden purchased high on a distant plateau where we can finally sit down and rest. It's the continuous action we all must take. And each generation must do its part to create an even more fair, more just society. One thing as I close, I'll say is I used to read civil rights leaders' quotes like this. And I thought, yeah, this is what he was saying back in his day, fighting his battle. And I read these quotes now, and that's not what he's doing. John Lewis understood everything I'm saying. He knew the battle for democracy never ends. If we thought it was over with the Voting Rights Act and the Warren Court, we simply weren't studying American history. It never stops. It especially gets intense when a diverse democracy anchored in voters of color becomes closer to fruition. The history of our country is that there always is backlash. And what John Lewis is saying here is not only to his colleagues from his fight, but it's our instruction now. All of us, continuous action, our entire footprint, fighting for democracy, that's what it's going to take. And obviously, at all levels, in the next 20 days, that's what's at stake. And after those 20 days, that battle just continues right on forward. So I know that was a lot. Happy to take questions, happy to hear thoughts. And I haven't had a chance to look at questions, but whether you throw them my way, however you want to throw them, and I'll take them on. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you, David. All right, welcome everyone. This is Randy Wilding, the Chief Operating Officer for the Doc C. Bracey Center for Human Reconciliation. I want to thank you, David, very much for your time and your knowledge. It has been exhilarating to hear you speak and to talk about all of the things that we could potentially do. And that will probably involve learning and being uncomfortable, which is something that we're intimately familiar with at the center. So I'm just going to jump right into the questions. This one is from Heidi. What are your thoughts on ranked choice voting?
Thank you. You know, this comes up often now, and it's not in my books, but the more I've dove in, the more open-minded I am to reform, especially reform that a variety of reforms around primaries that reduce the incentives to be on the extremes. And so I think ranked choice voting is a system that's proving to do that. I think it's frankly something that people who are on the extremes are threatened by. But no, I'm quite open to it. And I look at again, politicians are behaving to the incentive structures they see. And if they think they need to be super extreme to win, sadly, we see some politicians literally changing who they are to meet that extreme standard they think it takes to win. Ranked choice voting, I think, would actually create an incentive to be as broadly supported as possible, given that general, and I think it would actually change behavior. So I'm quite open to it.
Okay, thank you. All right, this one's from Woody. Would you support similarly sized red and blue states making interstate compacts to have independent redistricting commissions? It's hard for states to unilaterally disarm.
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, sadly, I mean, I'm a big believer in reform, but more Democratic states have, quote, disarmed than Republican states. And that has led to a little bit of a mismatch in terms of what gerrymandering is doing to the Congress. So I like that idea. And I do think one reason why we still see gerrymandering on both sides, and I'm asked all the time, so let's be clear. I know we're in a nonpartisan space here. I'm a Democrat, and one of the gotcha questions people throw at me all the time is, well, what about Democratic gerrymandering? And my response is, oh, I think it's terrible. I don't think gerrymandering is a failed system of government. It leads to poor incentives, and it leads to poor results. And the sooner it's gone from wherever it happens, the better. To your point, to the question, the lack of certainty about what other folks are doing does lead to a race to the bottom, because people don't want to unilaterally disarm. So New York gerrymandered last time, Ohio gerrymandered. I think a compact approach is not a bad idea, although I think that's hard. By the way, the best idea is, if it ever were to happen, and I wish that you could get bipartisan agreement on this, is federal legislation could actually eliminate gerrymandering, or at least set up a standard that all 50 states have to follow. It's part of the John Lewis and the Freedom to Vote Act. There is legislation there would set up rules that every state would have to follow, and I think it was actually something the Democrats should have pushed harder on. I wish Republicans, some, had not filibustered it, because there was a chance in 21 and 22 to get that done. It didn't happen. I think we may regret that for a generation. But I do think, short of the Supreme Court changing what it's doing, and right now it's not going to touch gerrymandering, I think federal legislation is the best way to have a 50-state approach. But either way, what I'd say is, if people can get rid of their partisan view for just a second, I think Republicans in Republican states should be demanding the end of gerrymandering as much as I am, because it leads to bad government, corruption, poor results, and you see it all over the country. It leads to a legislature that does not. Let's say Kansas is a Republican state, okay? Ohio leans Republican, Florida leans Republican, but in those states they are gerrymandered. The legislature does not reflect the Republican majority of their state. We see this in these abortion referenda, where the states, although Republican, are voting to repeal the very laws that their gerrymandered state houses are passing. So this shouldn't be viewed as just a partisan thing. What we have in these states are such gerrymandered legislatures whether the state is at its base more Republican leaning or Democratic leaning, it's simply not reflective. So my hope is, short of the a federal solution or the kind of compact, that people within these states, whatever their party affiliation is, figure out the system simply doesn't work. It's not good government. It's not representative government. Let's fix it. Thanks, Stephanie, for posting that.
Yeah, Stephanie, by the way, is I'm afraid we may lose her at some point to CNN or network, but she is our woman behind the scenes who is doing real-time sourcing of the things that we're talking about. So actually one from Michelle. What required reading would you recommend to a person who is an immigrant and is ignorant to the workings of the US government, voting, etc., so an informed decision can be made when voting?
Boy, that's a great question, Michelle.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer that these days diving into American history is really important, because everything I described tonight is repeating a pattern going back to our founding about a nonstop struggle for democracy. And so I don't know if I can name a book, but I wouldn't just say to that person, hey, go read a book about today's political battle. Because often these books would make you feel like all this stuff is new. I would have them dig through, books that tell the real story of American history, because that story is one where it's been, since the very beginning, a struggle between a more full democracy and an effort to not allow that to happen. And one of the things that's so troubling about censorship that is being attempted, usually that censorship is actually trying to censor out the worst parts of our history, where there was a backlash to a growing democracy. What got us Jim Crow, the horrible violence in the late 1800s and early to mid 1900s, when people tried to vote or tried to organize. And what that does is it leaves a false impression that the progress in America, if you censor out all that bad stuff, it leaves this false impression that it's been this one nonstop move towards progress. That's not our history. Our history has been an up and down. You know that old saying, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice? That also, and Martin Luther King, I think, has been kind of misinterpreted on saying that arc towards justice has not just been sort of automatically bending. It's been struggle. And so you'll see at the beginning of my second book, the arc is bending in the direction of whoever's pushing it the hardest. And often that arc has bent back the other way. We had an amazing revolution of a diverse democracy in the South in the late 1800s, and it was destroyed for 80 years in the most horrific ways. And then John Lewis had to fight back to get it. So it's a nonstop struggle. And I think it looks like you have a book club you mentioned here. I think finding the books that best capture that, and a lot of that will be written by African-American authors, to capture the pain of the worst moments. When you read those books, and if you look closely at what's happening today, you'll see a lot of parallels. Voter suppression based on myths of voter fraud that wasn't happening. Violence and violent talk emerging right as we have a diverse democracy and people of color across the board looking like they're the majority. This is a pattern that's repeated itself again and again. And I think books that introduce you to that really help people see the big picture now and how we best understand what's happening and how we best sort of fight through it.
Thank you, David. All right, this one's from Matt. Do you believe it's possible to reduce the influence of financial incentives in politics to make running for office more accessible and, by proxy, decrease the number of uncontested positions? If so, how do you propose to achieve this?
So this is a great question. In some ways, I think the answer is until you have a reversal of Citizens United or a constitutional amendment, big money's going to flow into the system. That doesn't leave me hopeless, though, because I do think two things are happening that kind of help combat that. And I don't get into this in my books as much as other things. But one, the explosion of low dollar giving through online giving, Kamala Harris raising $1 billion. That was mostly through everyday people putting in $10. So the good news is there's sort of been she's got more money than a billionaire, whatever amount he's worth, a billionaire Donald Trump. There's a democratizing of funding that is happening that I think in the end is healthy, because people now versus 20, 30 years ago are able to raise, if they're effective and they're inspiring. We do see some people able to raise a lot of money and combat the deep moneyed interests because everyday people are pitching in. So and the good candidates are figuring it out. I will say, though, that's at the highest level. The run everywhere level. So I was in Arizona 3 weeks ago, very conservative part of Arizona. And I was there to celebrate the fact that they are running in every district in Arizona, which is not something that you'd expect. And one reason to the question that they're running everywhere is they have public funding in Arizona for state house candidates. And that system of public funding gives people, even a tough district, a reason to think, hey, if I run and if I meet certain criteria, and they have to meet certain criteria to be what they call a clean candidate, they do get enough money to run a real race. And I saw directly that leads to more people running. So I wouldn't have even said this 5 years ago, but I actually think the public funding model in Arizona really shows me that if the problem for democracy is in many cases no one running at all, public funding, I think, is a very, frankly, low cost way of increasing the health of your democracy. For that exact reason, most state houses aren't going to do it. They don't want to get a post. But I actually think that to see it work in Arizona, I'm very impressed by it, and I do think it's a great way to incentivize people running in places where otherwise they may not ever get support.
Yes, I remember voting in Maryland with regards to that public funding.
Yeah.
Okay, should we expect, well, this one's a bit of a crystal ball. Should we expect another January 6th scale event this time around? How is a person who incited that when they lost able to run again?
That's mind-blowing. I think that I think we need a new rule in this country, and it's going to be stating the obvious. If someone is alleged to have organized a coup, the rule forevermore has to be you have the trial for that coup before the next election. Because if you don't, that person, as we're seeing today, has all the incentive to run again and has no disincentive from breaking every rule possible, because the only way they get out of being held accountable for the coup is by winning the next election. So by not bringing accountability to someone who staged a coup, and I think we all saw what we saw on January 6th, we literally incentivized him to run again because he saw it as his only way out. And if you go back in time when Trump re-announced his campaign for the second time, he was in a very dark place. It was not at the time viewed as this. He was sort of on the outside looking in. But I think the mistakes that have been made from the very beginning of the Biden term, not impeaching because people thought he would go away, waiting far too long to bring the cases, that has literally created a situation where Donald Trump actually, I think, believed, probably correctly, that the only way he would get away, he would not be held accountable for January 6th, was to run and win and make it all go away. So by not bringing that's the second half of the question. By not bringing accountability earlier, which other countries do, we literally set up what is happening right now. Really, 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 I think it will be looked back on history as a historic mistake. I do worry about not just January 6th. Someone wrote the other day, I worry that, one of the things I write about in my book, Laboratories of Autocracy, I don't just use that title as sort of a clickbait to people to read it. They act as laboratories, meaning they're always learning. They're always testing. If something works, they repeat it in other places. If something doesn't work, they correct for it. And I worry that January 6th, in the mind of those who tried to pull it off, the big mistake was it was too late to start it on January 6th. That Donald Trump, when he was calling up state reps, called them too late. And so the worry I have about the next January 6th is it's not January, it's December. It's mid-November. And they're making the calls then to try and get state reps and other officials to cause trouble, not by storming a Capitol in broad daylight where we can all see it, but doing it in some back room somewhere when votes are being counted or they have to be certified. So my worry is they'll be smarter about it this time than what was in the end, on national TV, this grotesque and violent effort. And they'll figure out, well, we don't need to do it that way next time. We can do it behind the scenes. They tried to do it with the Georgia Elections Commission. The court said they couldn't. That they learn from their mistakes, and they will do it in a more savvy way. And a couple things on that. Obviously, I see Democracy Doc. Sorry, I dropped the phone here. Democracy Doc has been quoted here. Brennan Center. I think lawyers have to be prepared for this a lot earlier. And secondly, I think if this is something that concerns you, the more decisive the margin on election night, the less likely any of this stuff is to take hold. If it's a narrow race, then this stuff is more potent and more problematic. If it's seen as sort of, this thing's over, it's more decisive. So if that gives motivation for people to do more, then hopefully people do more.
Understood. Thank you. And that's a perfect opportunity for me to remind everyone who is watching live or will be watching this recording in the future that our previous Let's Talk event was with Julie Farnham, and it was on the white power movement, talking about radicalization and also her personal experience during the January 6th insurrection. Another question. What risks and rewards might a constitutional convention pose?
That's a great question. So some of you may know that there's a way to do a constitutional convention, not through the people demanding it, but through a certain number of state houses doing it. And there is an organization that is trying to get together enough state houses that are largely gerrymandered to push through a convention that would be all risk and no reward. You take a bunch of, and this is why I say that the state house power, and this was not included in what I described here, but one state house power is if enough of them get together, 2/3, they can demand a constitutional convention. And at that convention, they could do whatever the heck they wanted. And they would do things that they would read a lot like Project 2025 or worse. So I think right now I'd say the biggest risk is that happens. One reason, by the way, one thing that happened in 2022 is if you go back to that slide I had of Michigan and Wisconsin, they have led efforts to end gerrymandering, which has pulled those state houses back from being what they were. That lowers the risk of a state house demanded convention that could be very damaging. Obviously, if you had a good, let's say a pro-democracy convention, you could repeal Citizens United. You could put the right to vote directly. I teach this stuff at the law school. One of the real issues in the American Constitution is nowhere does it say Americans have a right to vote. Other constitutions in the world say that. Ours says you cannot deny the right to vote based on this or based on that. It's a negative right. That is one of the reasons for all the problems in our history of voter suppression, that it doesn't spell out an affirmative right to vote. So people have that right suppressed based on wealth for many years or generations, or voter ID that makes it harder for 1 million people who don't have a driver's license to vote. They don't have an official federal right that's being violated. So yeah, if a bunch of pro-democracy advocates called a constitutional convention, we can learn from every mistake we've made since our founding about how the Constitution was written and certain compromises that were made that have made a full democracy more difficult. But right now, my worry is a convention coming forward is more likely to be one driven by state houses that goes in the wrong direction versus what I've talked about. Yes, in a dream scenario, you could correct for a lot of the problems that we're still grappling with because the right to vote was never affirmatively established as a federal right in the Constitution. That leaves up to courts. And in the right hands, like the Warren Court, that can be a great thing. But when you have other courts going a different direction, that quote unquote right to vote can be very, very sort of conditioned as we're seeing right now. Stephanie, you're like the greatest poster I've ever seen in a
It's
chat.
really amazing.
So I haven't seen that. Is a new constitutional convention a good idea? But that looks really, really interesting.
So talking about things that are really amazing, on your bookshelf behind you, you have Cast, which is one of the, excuse me, one of the books that I would definitely recommend to anyone who would like to dig a little bit deeper into American history, immigrant or not, anything that Isabel Wilkerson writes.
No, her book. I agree. And by the way, when I talk about books that frame our history as required reading, that's the kind of book I'm talking about.
Yep.
Oh, another amazing book that if you haven't read as a book club is Sundown Towns. Is a truly eye-opening book about a much deeper history to how African Americans were treated in this country than I think most non-African Americans will ever understand until they read a book like that.
Thank you. Thank you for the recommendation. Okay, so let's go on to another question. If the president is not reelected, will measures to save democracy never go forward without time?
Let me look at that one because I want to make sure I understand it. Say that one again.
If the president is not reelected, will measures to save democracy never go forward without time?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think on the federal level, and this is why I was very frustrated. I think there should have been a much more concerted push to pass the John Lewis and Freedom of Vote Act in 21 and 22 than occurred. Because I think, if you look back, going back to history again, there were moments in the late 1800s where people saw what was happening in the South. They saw Jim Crow coming. They saw the new racist white supremacy constitutions. And the federal government was on the precipice a few times of passing things that were similar to the Voting Rights Act. They fell a few votes short. And for 100 years almost, there was not the will to do it. And I worry that, yes, we are at a time right now where if certain elections go the wrong way, things that we cherish, like the Voting Rights Act, things that we could have gotten done, like ending gerrymandering. I don't mean to get too morbid, but I'm 53. My kids maybe will be in their 50s, and I probably won't be alive at a time where we can do those things. And that's what happened in the late 1800s. They fell, in one case, what would have been the equivalent of a Voting Rights Act in the late 1800s. It would have protected against decades of Jim Crow. Had the majority, but fell short because of the filibuster. And for 80 years, no blacks voted in the South, even though in the 1870s, their voting percentage was higher than whites. They destroyed it. And so, no, I think that in the wrong hands, things that we've been really close to doing or things that we've taken for granted, like the Voting Rights Act, will not come back again, potentially for a long time. And so, no, it's a very heavy moment. And I think that sometimes that seriousness of it all gets lost, that unless you fight for it when you have the chance, which they did not do in 22 like they should have, you may not get the chance to do it for years and years to come. I know that's sobering, but I also think
that was pretty morbid. So thank you for that.
It's just, but if you look at there is nothing more painful to me, and I've written about this, than the life of a African-American man in particular, born in the 1850s, who in their teenage years would have seen black elected officials, state Supreme Courts, majority House leaders in the Alabama State House, local sheriffs. They would have seen democracy all around them that looked like them. And everyone they knew, men, not women, obviously, the amendment hadn't come around yet, they would have seen people, African American, their elders voting in great numbers, 60% turnout in presidential elections, Black members of Congress for decades out of the South. When that person in the 1850s, around 1900, when they were 40, or 1910, when they were 50, not a single person they knew was voting, who was Black at least. Not a single Black elected official remained. And they'd spend the rest of their lives having seen democracy that they were part of gone. And in 1950, the big celebration was that a Black man got to play baseball when they had seen a full democracy when they were young. And so, yes, you can lose something great. And the way that we've learned our history in America, at least I think white Americans, we don't really appreciate the tragedy of the backsliding that took place. And that's why I worry that we don't see today that same backsliding can happen. I mean, again, I'm watching Stephanie here. You're the greatest incident researcher I've ever seen. So when I write my next book, I'm giving you a call.
Please do. She deserves it.
Yeah, I mean, wow.
Okay. So talking
but when you look
about-
at, by the way, she just posted Black legislators during Reconstruction. Look at the photos in the 1800s.
Yes.
You'll see a whole legislature where a majority was Black. And 20 years later, they are all gone. All gone. Why? Violence? Myths of voter fraud that led to voter suppression. Sound familiar? It's the same pattern.
And then also to your point about history, not have that be part of the documentation that we teach, to say this was possible, this was something that that people saw on a daily basis, and now it's lost to finding it or a chat during a live webinar.
Yeah.
So
and this is the part often that is censored. These are the things that the pain, this tactics, because the sad truth is many of the tactics that led to this destruction of that democracy I'm describing, they're not different than now. It's literally the same stuff. It's updated, but it's very similar. And again, it's voter fraud everywhere. When it's not proven in any way that there's mass voter fraud of the kind they're talking about. That's what they said in the 1880s. They had to clean up the rolls because the new Black voters were all being fraudulent. It wasn't true then. It's not true now, but it's leading to a suppression of certain voters that makes democracy out of reach for some.
David, thank you. And this next question, I have a personal connection to. I didn't write it, but I have a connection to. How long, and this goes to morbid as well, unfortunately, how long do our LGBTQ folks have if Project 2025 is implemented? Same for non-managers in the federal government employ.
So on a totally separate subject, I spent the last 4 months writing about Project 2025. And I'll go to the second question first. The civil servant is the complete target of Project 2025. And by the way, Donald Trump tries to run from Project 2025, but one of the things I've done in my research is it's all of them are working in conjunction. J.D. Vance said he would get rid of all the civil servants. He said it. It's not just Project 2025 saying it. He says it. So they want to replace tens of thousands of civil servants, scientists, hurricane trackers, pandemic experts, lawyers at the DOJ with complete political hacks. That is what Trump talks. It'd be the instrument of Trump's revenge. He talks about revenge. Well, they're going to replace the DOJ lawyers with a bunch of political hacks. As Stephanie put up here, my book about this is now a podcast, which I hope people will look at. It actually is. It turned into a podcast. Believe it or not, I'm still excited about this. I don't know how it ended up happening. I have these really well known. I'm going to share one of them right now. I have these very well-known actors and actresses who are reading the chapters, so it's pretty exciting for me. But I've tried to bring into like reality what this would all look like because it's so dark, it's hard to believe it. So here's a chapter that I released today about the attack on workers and unions that are part of Project 2025. I wrote one a few weeks ago. You all remember Toby from The West Wing? Well, he reads the chapter where I describe the taking over of the, I'll put this up here, the taking over of the DOJ by total political hacks. Exactly how it's being proposed and Project 2025 would make happen. The mass deportation, maybe of all the things in there, that and the use of the military to crack down on protesters, maybe the darkest and most deadly of the promises. I have a chapter spelling out what it would look like. On LGBTQ, I have a whole section. It's included in what I just put here. The protections against discrimination based on sexual orientation, LGBTQ plus status, basically are ripped away. The kind of court, but there's a lot of sort of Christian right extremism that flows through Project 2025, and this would basically make federal policy that essentially discrimination based on religious views, and we know what that means, is okay. And so there's a lot in here about that as well. So, there's a lot of groups that are basically the targets of Project 2025. And they're frankly, in many ways, all sort of in different ways in jeopardy if it happens. And I've tried very hard to work on trying to make it real. I really worry here. One of the things that's happening in the country right now is I think it's so bad people don't want to believe it. I hear J.D. Vance say the other day, "Oh, Trump didn't do anything in his first term like this. It wouldn't happen." Glenn Youngkin the other day was saying, "Oh, the military thing would never happen." People are saying Project 2025 would never happen. Um, the That's a mistake. I believe every word of Project 2025 should be taken deadly seriously. Trump makes the same promise in every single stump speech about mass deportation, no vaccines in schools, all this stuff. I believe if they win, they will claim a mandate for all of it. Hey, people knew we were saying this, and they voted for it. The people spoke. And so I think the responsible position is not to say, "Oh, that would never happen." It's to say, if they're saying it repeatedly, it could very well happen. And we better take it seriously because of that. And so that's one reason I did this sort of Project 2025 project I'm doing, is to have it be real. And my hope is that people disseminate it to people they know who aren't taking it seriously, or who say, "Well, I hear this, oh, Trump just says that, but I like this." No, if he just says something in every stump speech, take it very seriously.
Thank you, David. Okay, this is another question from before we began the event, the pre-event survey. I would love to hear him talk about how specifically the upcoming election will challenge and reinforce democratic norms and practices. Also wonder what he thinks of Freedom by the Eastern European historian Timothy Snyder.
Say that last part again. My phone fell off my desk here.
I also wonder what he thinks of On Freedom by the Eastern European historian Timothy Snyder.
By the way, I'm sitting here in Cincinnati. Timothy Snyder is from Wilmington, Ohio. So he's a good Ohioan and an Eastern European expert. My hope is that we do see democratic norms reinforced in this election, and that a election in the right direction, and again, not just presidential, democracy will be determined by results at multiple levels. And my hope is that this becomes a democracy reinforcing election. And I don't just say that idly. Since 2022, that's what we've seen. We have seen a winning streak for democracy itself again and again. I mentioned the one in Ohio last August, where groups came together across party lines to protect democracy against the state house attacking it. The end of gerrymandering in Wisconsin. We see ballot initiatives where the majority will of the people have been reflected, and not by the gerrymandered state house, but by the people. Since Dobbs in 22, we have actually seen a winning streak for democracy. By the way, I showed you that very depressing slide about uncontested races. November of 24, there are far fewer uncontested races than November of 22. So I'm hopeful about all this stuff. Don't get me, I believe in a wake-up call to see the bad picture. But there's a winning streak for democracy at the state house level in the last couple of years that we can continue. But to go back to it, in Florida, that chart I showed you, there were like 30 uncontested races. There's 0 now. In North Carolina, they were like 30. There are 2 uncontested races. In Arizona, there were many, not a single uncontested race in Arizona. Many of them are supported by public financing. Not a single uncontested race in Idaho. My hope is that because a lot of people are starting to see what's happening, that there's a new normal. The old normal was, oh, we leave half the districts uncontested. Who cares? Doesn't matter. My hope is the new normal is state houses really matter, and uncontested races are unacceptable to a healthy democracy, as is gerrymandering, unacceptable to a healthy democracy. And we put it in we defeat gerrymandering everywhere, Democrat or Republican, and we contest in far more places. And my hope is that long term, if that's the positive arc that we build, not just in 24, but that we frankly be building 22, 23, and 24. If that happens, despite some tense times, then I think we're pushing that arc in the right way, as opposed to having it pushed the wrong way.
Thank you. Okay, this goes to some of what you discussed during your presentation. It's definitely more targeted to maybe people who have felt estranged from anything that's happening in politics ever, or don't fully understand, as you stated, what is actually happening in their state and local governments. How does someone who has not been involved in their community but wants to assist in saving democracy at the local level, what would you advise?
Great question. So by the way, I'm not here to sell books. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a link to a website where I kind of answer this, and it's called Build Your Own Personal Plan to Lift Democracy. I'll give you the link so you can look at that. It includes that footprint model I talked about. But to cut to the chase on that, I would think to yourself, it depends on if you're kind of into politics or not. If you're into politics, one thing I would definitely do is make sure you do not allow uncontested races where you are. If you're in an area that there's been some incumbent never challenged for years, and if you think they're really representing you, wonderful. But if you think they're just there uncontested but not doing a good job, make a commitment that in your community someone will run against them, because that accountability is good, and help them. But the second one is the nonpartisan ways you can help democracy are enormous. And that's where I go through that footprint. So much of the attack on democracy, in many places at least, is keeping people from being involved, suppressing the vote, or making things so bad that people decide they don't want to vote even if they're registered. And that's the part where I'd say even more so than helping people run or supporting or running yourself. And running yourself is one of the ways that you can keep an uncontested race from happening. Helping engage citizens of your community to get involved. The sky is the limit. Like I talked about, are you on the board of a homeless shelter? Are you in a fraternal organization? You could spend your footprint in that organization. A homeless shelter is one of the great places to get people who are not participating to participate. These are often the people who are purged from the polls. If you live at a senior center, make sure everyone there is registered. And if they happen to have a driver's license, make sure they know that. There's so many ways from community grassroots level that you could be lifting democracy. And too often, because we think of the battle as 5 or 6 Senate races or electoral college states that matter, we don't do what we could be doing locally. Think through your entire footprint and put it to work for democracy. There's so many things you could be doing. And I give examples of that at the website I mentioned.
Thank you, David. Okay, this one touches on Australia. What is your position on moves being made or have been made to have government penalize misinformation deemed harmful, especially recently in Australia? Isn't this sort of thing edging liberal democratic societies closer to how liberal autocracies are and what they want?
That's a great question. I think there is a danger. There is a danger of government policing political speech that I think is something to worry about. There's also, though, defamation and other laws that we all think, I think, generally make sense. But I do think it's not as easy as maybe sometimes it's meant is characterized to be. I worry overall, though. We used to have something called the fairness doctrine. They got rid of it. It kind of required balance. So I think there are clearly some ways to regulate this new, largely unregulated social media environment. So disinformation isn't everything. And right now, I hate to say it really is. I think, but I don't, I say this as a lawyer, I say this as a believer in the First Amendment. I think it's not simple. But the thing that I worry about, and I'm not an expert on this, but we're seeing right now in the way that Twitter is run and other media, how much it can distort democracy. Intentional misinformation can totally distort the conversation. I say this 100, I say this 80 miles from Springfield, Ohio. Intentional disinformation has turned that community upside down. That the mayor, a Republican, is begging his own senator to stop lying about it. That at some point there's got to be some fine line that the government through Congress can regulate in the way that the fairness doctrine used to regulate the airwaves. And I do think that social media is so unregulated and now gotten so important that a complete lack of regulation entirely is clearly turning us all upside down. And every day is this sort of crazy search for what's actually even remotely close to the truth. One other way to think about it, and this gets back to the question about the media, where a journalism outfit to pay for delivering the truth with real reporters has a paywall often. Disinformation is free. So we literally have to pay for the truth in America, which many aren't going to do, but we get obliterated by sort of disinformation, often coming from other countries. And so there's something really warped right now about the whole sort of atmosphere around media. And I think I hate to say it, we go back to big money. Big money may keep it from happening. But I do think a conversation about how do we come up with something more sane than free disinformation everywhere. You have to pay for the truth, which many people won't pay for, warping the entire conversation, not about just politics, but society more generally. So I wish I was more of a deep philosopher on this topic, but something needs to be done. But it's not. It certainly isn't simple. And you can get uncomfortable pretty quickly if you feel like government itself is getting into almost a censorship business. That can be a line that can be crossed in bad ways very fast. I hope that's helpful.
I think it is. Another question. My city is considering moving local elections to off years. I was not aware that could happen. That was for me. Not presidential or midterm. What impact does this have?
Well, first of all, I don't mean to say this as a criticism. I don't even like the term off year because it makes a sense that those local elections don't matter as much. So we'll just say in the odd year. I actually think having been on a city council, I think it's a good thing. I think it gives more space for those conversations to be had. And sometimes the results in the even presidential year, we'll call it, are simply determined by the turnout around the presidential and doesn't necessarily give the local elections the focus they need. So for local school board, mayor, council, having it in the odd year, I think can mean that people have time to focus. And it doesn't only reflect the turnout of a presidential year, which can kind of overwhelm everything else. For example, the democracy battles we had last year in Ohio. We had a reproductive freedom battle in November. We had the one in August I mentioned that protected direct democracy. I think it was healthy that it was in those years because it allowed people to really focus on those races as opposed to getting caught up in simply the presidential. Right now, we have this issue one on gerrymandering. I think if this were on the ballot in Ohio last year, it would pass easily. Now it may just become an extension of the Trump turnout, which won't reflect on the issue as much as just to reflect on who showed up to vote for Trump versus Kamala Harris, which doesn't really give the issue, I think, the focus it deserves. So I think that's generally probably a healthy thing.
Thank you. Okay, another question. In states like Minnesota with same-day registration, is registering voters still important?
In advance?
That's
Yeah, I
all
mean,
I
by the way,
have.
I'm a big fan of same-day registration. Um, but yeah, if you can get folks to advance and to register in advance, that's even better. But I do believe in that system. I think in Ohio that we used to have a week where you could register and vote on the same day. They got rid of that. It's a very pro voter. It's a very pro voter reform. It doesn't lead to fraud. It's just pro voter. So I'm jealous of the states that have it. But no, if you register someone in June, you're going to have more success making sure they ultimately vote. So it's still better to register in advance. But what's sad about what's happening in the country right now in the states with suppression. There are so many positive reforms that are leading to more people voting, which is what you'd hope people would want. There's a longer window of no fault voting early, vote by mail. There are drop boxes in states. Again, it's not partisan. There are drop boxes in Alaska. There are drop boxes in Colorado. The more drop boxes, the more people are voting. There's no fraud. It's just convenient. In Denver, your drop box is within 10 minutes of where you live, no matter where you live. In Ohio, we have one drop box per county, including counties of 1 million people. It's outrageous. So what's sad is we have a lot of reforms that are working, that make it easier, that better reflect the people. And in some states, they literally don't want to do them. They want to do the opposite. They want to right now we have a system in Ohio, rather than doing automatic voter registration or rather than doing same-day registration or automatic voter registration, which means when you sign certain government documents with an address, it automatically updates to your voter file. In Ohio, they purge people for moving, or they purge people voting for infrequently. And so we have every year, hundreds of thousands removed. If you had same-day registration, that could be corrected right away. They just won't do it. And so we know that's having a disproportional impact on all sorts of groups in Ohio. And it's not by accident. So it's very frustrating that we have these reforms that make sense, that lead to more people voting. And in some states where they clearly want certain people not voting, they do the opposite of those reforms.
Thank you. All right, this question starts with a statement. Democracy is nonpartisan, but if one party is anti-democracy, doesn't everything become partisan? Makes it difficult to talk about voting democracy in workplaces, etc.
Let me say that. Run that by me one more time.
Democracy is nonpartisan, but if
Yes.
one party is anti-democracy, doesn't everything become partisan?
Yes, it's a real problem. That's why, let me just be very clear. That's why I give great credit to Republicans right now in a party that has a strong element that's battling against democracy. Some are speaking out. Liz Cheney, Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, who are putting democracy over their party. They're still Republicans, but and I think that the fact that some are saying so is helping to keep what's happening. It's happening to the extent it was asked, but to have some saying, listen, I believe in democracy. I'm willing to speak out against my party or those in it who are against democracy. It underscores how important those people are. Because if you truly had nobody doing that, then the question would be absolutely, there's no way to talk about it. But I really credit those who are speaking out from their own party about attacks on democracy coming from their own party. I wish more would do it. To the extent some are, though, I think it really is. It's heroic, and I hope they continue to do it, and I hope they continue to do it from the party that they're in, because if everyone who believes in democracy leaves the Republican Party, then again, we can't really have a conversation about democracy that isn't about party, which is not good.
Thank you. Okay, a different kind of area. Could you talk to your time in Russia? What was it like?
Where did that come from?
That was a
So
someone just dropped it in.
yeah, no, I happy to. This is going to sound crazy for those who don't know it. I worked in St. Petersburg, Russia between 1993 and 1996. I was working there right after college as part of a project that was trying to assist St. Petersburg in undertaking reforms to kind of westernize and be part of a democracy and market economy. I loved it. I loved St. Petersburg, beautiful city. I really enjoyed meeting so many people there. But in that time, this is the part that's going to scare people. The vice mayor of the city of St. Petersburg, who was the liaison to my project, was Vladimir Putin. I used to meet with him regularly when he was part of a Western-minded city government. That his boss was literally the author of the Russian Constitution. He was sort of a Western-minded democracy advocate, and so I loved my time there. I did spend time in a lot of meetings with Putin, and I'll just say when he was picked as president, I was worried because he was so different from the other Russians I met. He did not have this inclination that I sensed among others that they wanted sort of to move closer to the West, that they had sort of a small d democracy instinct. He was quite different. You knew he was a former spy. So I enjoyed my time there, and it's tragic to me. And it's again a lesson that you can destroy. Not that they had a full-fledged democracy ever in the 90s, but they were moving in one direction, and you start chopping it away at institutions. I would not have imagined that Russia would fall like it has so quickly into not being a democracy anymore. So I enjoyed it, and it's tragic to see what's happened since. And it's this bizarre kind of. I call myself the Forrest Gump of Russia, where I was meeting with all these famous people who would be famous later, but I had this very bizarre, experience that I met with him, and I met with people who now lead major companies there, who are the oligarchs. I knew them all when they were in their 20s and 30s.
Thank you. Okay, this one's from Matt. How would you encourage those who have a distrust in the government to re-engage and not be apathetic?
To re-engage and not be apathetic.
With it that have a distrust.
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I encourage voting either way. And if I don't have a trust completely either. What I would say is just the same reason you should engage, however you feel. It's either you weighing in everybody else. Why would you let other people be the ones to determine the direction of your government? If you don't trust it, well, get involved and get the people involved who you do trust, so they're empowered to do what you hope they do. Or if you don't trust, vote the people you don't like out. It's really, in the end, it's our government. So I think the idea that you'd not get involved because you don't trust it seems like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then everyone else picks folks, and the very people you may not trust are probably going to stay there if people like you who don't trust them don't get involved. So I would say that, but this is, I don't mean to take it lightly. I actually think one of my great criticisms of the Democratic Party is that we don't talk enough to people who have decided that voting doesn't change their life, so why do it? The problem is not only unregistered voters who are suppressed, it's voters who've decided, potentially for a good reason, that voting has never done anything good for them. And oftentimes, the way that all the data is crunched and the targeting is done, those voters get treated like garbage. If they're even talked to at all, it's a knock on the door with a week to go saying, don't forget to vote. And that person in their mind's like, I don't vote because I don't think it matters. You knocking on my door with a week to go or calling me 10 times or texting me 20 isn't changing my mind about that. In fact, it's sort of confirming why I think you guys are all about yourselves and not me. And I think we have to do a much better job of conversing with these folks way early in the cycle and going back to what people can do. Often the best messenger to those voters who've decided voting doesn't matter isn't the campaign volunteer, the politician. It's the nurse at the health clinic who made them healthier, or their kids healthier. It's the person who gave them food at the food bank saying, while we're getting this food, you also might consider getting involved in voting because maybe you could vote for people who could help long term. And so I think that it's a good question, and I think it clearly taps into a reality that many people are choosing not to participate because they don't think it matters. And too often these elections, those people are not engaged in a way that changes their mind that they've decided voting doesn't change anything for them. And in the end of the day, we often measure voter turnout based upon registered voters. So that makes it look higher than it is. But when you actually look at the number of people voting based on the total population of voter eligible citizens, it's ridiculous how many people are simply not involved in democracy. And in the end, I think that makes the democracy a lot weaker than it should be.
So would you go door to door and encourage people to register to vote or to vote, regardless of their affiliation,
Yeah, I think it's how, I mean, my first view is to go to the people who've been suppressed intentionally. And that's happening. I would start with people who literally are being specifically targeted, and are not involved because of that. And I just think that's such an injustice that I'd pull them back in. And by the way, that could include people of either party, seniors or young people. We see a lot of young people being discouraged from being part of it through voter ID laws that don't include student IDs. They include driver's licenses. A lot of young people don't have driver's licenses. So I would correct that for those groups that are being targeted and not really care what party they're in. It's just wrong. Interestingly, there was an effort in Ohio when I was chair of the Ohio Democratic Party to make it a lot harder for young college students to vote. And college Democrats and college Republicans together worked to overturn that law. And I was part of that. And I love that it was all young people. It wasn't just one party. But yeah, I just think a more full participation is just more healthy. But the targeting of certain groups is the thing that I would my first priority is to overcome that injustice, which has especially been fierce since 2011.
Thank you. I'm going to do one more question and then we're going to transfer you to Paul and his close. This is from Kristen. How do we deal with saving democracy when some people do not want to talk about politics because of various reasons? And you've covered this in different ways. So I would
but
love
I
to
actually have a different answer than I've said tonight.
You can say whatever you want.
Yeah. What I would say on that is make it about, this is going to sound strange. Most people, I would not address it through just the 30,000 debate about democracy. I would make it about the issues that matter to them. I would say in some states, the reason why, again, not everyone on this call may agree with this, but the reason why abortion is banned in your state, even though 60% of your state's population doesn't think it should be, is democracy. But the effect on you is that you are losing a freedom because of it. I would, public education is being undermined in places where democracy is weak. People care about their public schools. They want a good school for their kids. So the best way to address the lack of democracy in many places is not to have a 30,000 foot sort of debate like the founding fathers about democracy. It's to show that the issues people care about are systematically being undermined. Remember that slide about the incentive system being all screwed up in these states without democracy? It's the issues the issues that are being undermined directly impact their lives, and it's a lack of democracy that keeps them from doing anything about it. And so I think the more you get people, and this is especially true of young people, the more you can tie it to issues that they care about in their lives, that they're sweating about, that they're worried about, I think the better the conversation will be than just think about it one other way. Most young people, democracy hasn't looked that great to them. All they see is crazy politics, student debt, global warming that the adults don't do anything about, school shootings. If you only say, hey, save democracy, they're going to say, well, the whole thing looks broken to us. And so I think you got to make it about issues that they care about, and that fixing democracy is the way to actually address issues that people care about, that they're passionate about. I think that's the best way to frame it for most people you're talking to.
David, thank you so much. I am going to turn the mic over to Paul. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you and learning. Again, thank you, Stephanie, for your diligent work on researching and giving us some resources. To be clear, everyone who is registered for the event will receive a copy of the event. It'll be available off the center website in the next coming days. That will also include all of the resources that were mentioned in the chat. And with that, I would like to turn the mic over to Paul. Thank you very much again, and have a wonderful night.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoyed it.
I want to thank you again, David, for this evening and for all the information. And hopefully more of us will be serious about the threat and look at what we can do in our communities. One thing that's important to us that I think people need to understand, that we bring you these programs based on donations that you make to us. And so I hope you consider that. If you enjoyed this, it was informative to you, consider donating to us. The other thing I would encourage you to do is to share David's presentation and the one that Julie, our last webinar, shared on the white power movement, to help people understand this is not a Republican or Democrat issue. This is about democracy and how we save it. So again, I want to thank David. I want to thank the staff at the center, and thank you for attending, and have a good evening.